Grow powerful in union with the Lord, in union with His mighty strength. Use all the armor and weaponry that God provides so that you will be able to stand against the deceptive tactics of the adversary. For we are not struggling against human beings, but against the rulers, authorities, and cosmic powers governing this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. So take up every piece of war equipment God provides, so that when the evil day comes, you will be able to resist. And when the battle is won, you will still be standing. Therefore, stand. Moab's brother nation, Israel, was camped in the plains of Moab after defeating two of Moab's most powerful enemy nations. Fearing his nation would be next, and realizing he could not defeat Israel on the battlefield, Balak, the king of Moab, enlisted the soothsayer Balaam to curse Israel. 3 times Balaam tried, and 3 times Yahweh refused to curse Israel, but blessed Israel instead. Balak and Balaam found that Yahweh will never curse Israel. That could have been the end of that story, but Hasatan still had his favorite trick in his arsenal. We learn of this in Bamidbar Numbers 25, the Peor affair. Here, in this warning example, since Yahweh would not curse Israel, Hasatan would enlist the aid of Israel to curse themselves. Here in Numbers chapter 25, really nothing could be more relevant. So we're going to get right into this now, verse 1 through 3.
Israel stayed in Shittim, and the people began to play the prostitute with the daughters of Moab, for they called the people to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate and bowed down to their gods. Israel joined himself to Baal Peor. Yahweh's anger burned against Israel.
It's so interesting. Yahweh had defended Israel before Moab and even defended their righteousness. Balaam was really unable to curse them. Yahweh wouldn't let that happen. But now we see a different tact here. It mentions, though, Israel's location. It says that Israel was in Shittim. This is the last stop before finally they did go into Canaan. And the word Shittim, it's a certain kind of a tree. And today we call it the acacia tree. These grow all over Arabia. This word is actually shortened from a larger word that we find in Numbers 33:49 for this place called Abil Shittim, or Meadow of the Acacias. So apparently this was a place that was near the river, so acacia trees were growing there, and it was probably somewhat more pleasant than much of the desert that Israel had been through. So this is where Israel was at the time, and of course this is right actually in the border of Moab. Everything is looking so good right now. They've just had these big victories and they're all just doing so well. And at the very time that they're feeling like that, the enemy has this scheme going on that's really going to bring tremendous hurt on the nation. He's always wanting to steal your victory. Of course, he's always scheming against you. This is why we can't afford to get overconfident, as possibly happened here with Israel. We're going to get in now to the nature of this scheme. It tells us what happened. They called the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel joined himself to Baal Peor. And of course, the thing that led them into disaster here was sexual immorality. So they're in this relaxed attitude, and there was a scheme with these Moabite and Midianite women. It wasn't just that they thought these Hebrew guys were good looking or something. They might have said that, but the truth is they had a hidden agenda. Their agenda was to corrupt Israel and to draw them into idolatry against Yahweh. So as these men became enamored with these women, in order to be well thought of by them and be able to make progress in their unrighteous relationships with them, they joined with them in sacrifice to their gods and worshiping their gods. And as it says here, Yahweh's anger burned against Israel. At this point in time, pretty much every Bible believer of every stripe is faced with a very similar situation. Our culture in America is totally changing. Immoral behavior is considered the norm now. If you don't approve of it, you could actually end up, for example, losing your job, or worse could happen to you as time goes by. So there's pressure to conform. So therefore, a desire to hang on to the things that we want, hang on to your job, hang on to your position within your community, or so on. In a sense, couldn't that be an inducement to bow down to the false gods of the world? I think it's a big issue. We have to be concerned about this today. To end up actually bowing down to these false gods, it shows you how much a person can sink. One day you can be in total victory, and really, if you take the wrong step, pretty soon you can be doing things that are disastrous to yourself. It's amazing, really, how quickly these men fell into these acts of worship to these false gods. Fulfilling their desires of their lower nature induced them into this sin. That this is a plot becomes very clear when we get into Numbers 31, because there in verse 16, it tells us that this happened, or this was caused, through the counsel of Balaam. So this was a scheme that Balaam introduced when he was unable to curse Israel. Apparently, he came up with this scheme, which he then counseled to the Midianites. This scheme was employed against Israel with horrible success. And it says that Yahweh's anger burned against Israel. Balaam is guilty just like Satan is guilty. In the garden, Satan, through lies and deception, induced mankind into sin. But then the sinners are guilty for the choices they make. Same thing here. Balaam was guilty, and those who conspired with him, they were guilty in trying to do harm to Israel. But then those Israelites were guilty too because of the choices that they made. So all of a sudden, a time of victory and joy turned into a time of tremendous folly, a disaster really for Israel. Yahweh rightly was burning with anger towards them because of their unfaithfulness to him. Now we want to talk a little bit about Baal Peor and exactly who he was and what this kind of worship is so that we can understand more about why Yahweh was so angry over this. Baal Peor is not really the name of the god. Baal means Lord, and Peor is the mountain where this Baal was worshipped. This is a way of identifying who this god is without actually saying its name. It is named elsewhere. Baal Peor is named, for instance, in the book of Kings, Jeremiah, and other places. It's the same as the god Chemosh, who was the god of the Moabites. As we look into this more, we find that Chemosh was known by a number of different names in different places. Hosea chapter 9 talks about this god of the Moabites. In Hosea chapter 9, it associates him with the Semitic goddess Ashtar. This is the duo of Chemosh and Ashtar that was actually worshipped at Baal Peor. The scripture in Hosea 9:10 says, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe figs in the fig tree at its first season. But they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the shameful thing and became abominable like that which they loved. It's telling us what happened with Israel. They were corrupted at this incident of Baal Peor. It changed them, and they became abominable like this false god. The Septuagint version of Hosea 9:13 makes very plain what happened too. It says, Ephraim, even as I saw, gave their children for a prey. Yea, Ephraim was ready to bring out his children to slaughter. And this is talking about the worship of Baal Peor and the goddess Ashtar. It involved not only human sacrifice, but sacrifice of children. The Targum says about this verse, They of the house of Ephraim have sinned in slaying their children to the service of idols. Now, it's interesting that these verses don't talk about this aspect of it here in Numbers, but they are mentioned there in Hosea. When we understand that this worship even involves such things as the sacrifice of children, you can understand why Yahweh would call this abominable and would be so angry about it. I want to talk about the goddess who is the consort of Chemosh, and this is the goddess Ashtar. This is a name that is used in slightly different ways, is translated in slightly different ways in different languages. So Ashtar to the Moabites is Astarte to other of the ancient Middle Eastern peoples, but it's the same one. In the scriptures also, this same goddess is called Ashtoreth. This same goddess was later also worshipped by the Sidonians and the Phoenicians. It was part of the worship of Ahab and Jezebel that they introduced into Israel. Ashtoreth is really Ashtoreth with the vowel pointing from the word Bosheth, which means abomination. So rather than actually say the word, they took the vowels from the Hebrew word for abomination and inserted them into the word to indicate the name of this goddess, which gives you some idea how this goddess is regarded by Yahweh and by righteous Israel. So this is Astarte. According to various sources, historical sources, and so forth, Astarte was connected with fertility, sexuality, and war. She's almost always represented as naked in all of the representations of her, and was first worshipped in Syria and Canaan in the first millennia BC, so very, very early. Some ancient texts that have been found, Ugaritic ancient texts, equate her with the goddess Ishtar, another way of saying her name, Ishtar. And Ishtar has been transliterated as Easter, Easter. This goddess Easter, which is the goddess of fertility, the celebration of Ishtar, Astarte, the same goddess, interestingly, that was worshipped there along with the Baal of Peor. This is the celebration from which Easter comes. The date is taken from that, and some of the customs, such as eggs and bunnies. These things are borrowed directly from the pagan customs having to do with Easter, called the Queen of Heaven in some places in Scripture. So this gives you a pretty good picture of who these gods are, and what they practiced was something sometime called sympathetic magic or sympathetic worship. In the spring is when this was celebrated. They looked for these gods, of course, to cohabit together to bring fertility in the crops and all the livestock, the people, so on. They thought all of this happened through the gods and goddesses cohabiting together. So this was part of their worship. It's called sympathetic magic, doing the things that you want the gods to do. So they had these orgies that were in celebration of these gods. They had temple prostitutes to bring in funds for the upkeep of the temples and so forth of the gods and to honor the gods. This was all part of their worship. So it wasn't uncommon at all for these women to do this with Israel, because this is what they did. It was part of their worship. It was not unusual to them, but it certainly should have been unusual to the Israelites. So this is the story of how this could happen. After this happened, now this is the first time that Israel actually engaged in this kind of worship. And this was going to be going on around them in Canaan, this same worship. After being introduced into this here, this remained a snare to them throughout the time that they were in the Promised Land. There were apostates that kept reverting back to this abominable form of worship all the way until the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. So over hundreds of years, they kept turning back to this false worship. They had tasted of this, and it had infected them. So they just had kept turning back to it. Verse 4 and 5.
Yahweh said to Moses, "Take all the chiefs of the people, and hang them up to Yahweh before the sun, that the fierce anger of Yahweh may turn away from Israel." Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Everyone kill his men who have joined themselves to Baal Peor."
Yahweh needed to do something to show the nation as a whole how damaging this is and to stop them all from running into this worship so that the whole nation would be completely lost. So here we have Yahweh's instructions to Moses about what to do. It involved the chiefs of the people, the commanders. In verse 5, it calls them the judges of Israel. It says, "Take all the chiefs of the people and hang them up to Yahweh before the sun, that the fierce anger of Yahweh may turn away from Israel." What this assumes you already know. We've already been through the earlier part of the Torah that set forth judges and courts. Yahweh is here then giving instructions that the judges, on finding the guilty parties after due process of the court, would take the guilty and it would be hung up to Yahweh before the sun. The sun was part of the worship of Baal Peor because the sun brings about the fertility. So this was a direct insult to this false god. And it was also sort of an ironic punishment for them, that if they were going to worship the sun, this is how they would end up. When others who hadn't yet gotten involved in this saw this punishment, perhaps it would deter others from ending up the same way. So this was really in the best interest of the whole nation too, while being a just punishment in itself. It was really a fight. It was a struggle for the life of the nation here. Because if this nation went over to the worship of these other gods, the end result was going to be horrible for them, and any of them doing this was horrible for the whole nation. Especially because Israel was already in a covenant with Yahweh, and they promised that they belonged to Him and to no other God. And so for them to join themselves now to another God, that is not only against the covenant, but it's abhorrent to the covenant. So they actually became part of this other God. And of course, this was something that was so unholy that it was creating a triad between them and these other two gods. And Yahweh can't handle that. He's not going to allow that. Otherwise, He would be sullying Himself with their adultery and their immoral behavior and their idolatry. And He just couldn't do that. If you think about this word, joined, there are people today that join themselves immorally with other people. Some of those people almost think of that like some kind of recreation, as if it's not really going to affect them. The scriptures are so different about that, because when you're joined to somebody else, you become part of them. It does have an effect. It is going to have an effect on your life. You can't just take that in a casual way. There's reasons why Yahweh has all of these commandments, because to go against them is to sin against our own self. I think that's what you'd have to say these Israelites did. Not only did they sin against Yahweh, they sinned against their own selves and their families and their nation and everything that they held dear. And so that made them worse than the heathens. Not only as bad as the heathens, worse. And it made them totally useless. Verse 6.
Behold, one of the sons of Israel came and brought to his brothers a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses, and in the sight of all the congregation of the sons of Israel, while they were weeping at the door of the tent of meeting.
All the congregation, it says. So this must have been the majority of the congregation were weeping at the door of the tent of meeting. Probably the ones that are there weeping at the door of the tent of meeting, they're probably innocent. And this is the majority of the Israelites. And I think when we look at the story, we should remember that about Israel, that this was a large minority that nevertheless brought tremendous pain on the whole nation. Sometimes it happens like that. This is the picture we have here. Now just imagine all of these Israelites weeping, crying because of what is happening here. They're just seeing this wickedness. They're seeing the trouble that this is bringing on the nation and on perhaps some of their own family members. And they're on holy ground at the door of the tent of meeting. This is the precinct of the tabernacle itself that we're talking about. This is a holy area. And here in this holy area, with these holy people who are upholding righteousness there, what happens? He's joined himself to her. This person is someone who is analogous to a temple prostitute in this worship of Baal. And now he's taking her and bringing her right into the midst of Israel, but not just Israel, right into the holiest precinct of Israel. This man and the others that involved themselves with the Moabites, they might have thought that they were somewhat more progressive, not stick in the muds like the other Israelites. And after all, why do we have to hold ourselves apart from these other nations? This is a way that we can develop closer ties with some of these surrounding nations, have more unity here in the area. So this is a good thing we're doing. Clearly, this man had no conscience against what he was doing. So he must have had some sort of a conscientious justification in his mind, thinking that it was a good thing. And it just occurs to me that so often people who involve themselves in immoral behavior think they're the ones that are right. They have some kind of a justification for the evil that they're doing, even though it's wrong, and even though it is an insult and a wrong against their community and the people with them. That's what happened here with this man. He was not having any regard for how this was going to affect those around him. Certainly had no regard for holiness or righteousness. We'll read 7 through 9.
When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose up from the middle of the congregation and took a spear in his hand. He went after the man of Israel into the pavilion and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through the belly. So the plague was stayed from the sons of Israel. Those who died by the plague were 24,000.
We just picture all of these Israelites there at the tabernacle, all weeping and crying over this sin that's going on. And this man bringing this Midianite prostitute in the midst of all of them. This was in the pavilion. So he had brought her into the pavilion there in verse 8. The Hebrew word for pavilion here, it's not just the same as tent, which is why it's translated differently in English. It's a large vaulted tent. In other words, it's the kind of a big tent that you would use for some sort of public use. So this might have been some sort of a public meeting place. It might be a place where the elders even would come to meet, or some other kind of public use. This wasn't even his own home that he brought her to. He brought her to the pavilion, which was part of that public area in that holy area of the tabernacle. I think that's important for us to realize what he was actually doing. He wasn't even doing this in the privacy of his own home. He was actually violating this sanctified area there in the precinct of the tabernacle. So we have here the story now of Phinehas and how Phinehas reacts. Is this an example then that when we see unrighteousness, we should grab a spear and run it through somebody? You know, I've often heard this presented in a way that would kind of leave you with that impression. But that's not really what this story is about. I'd like to read something from 1 Chronicles 9:20 that helps us with this. It's talking about the priestly lineage and a certain branch of that lineage there. And it says, their fathers, being over the host of Yahweh, were keepers of the entry. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, was the ruler over them in time past, and Yahweh was with him. So this little piece of information tells us that Phinehas was the ruler over those who were the keepers of the entry. In other words, he was the ruler over the security guards, the holy security guards, that were to keep all unholy individuals out of the holy area, out of the sanctified area. And he was the leader of them. So that was part of his office. That was part of his duty. What we see about Phinehas is not only was he offended by what happened, as the others were, but he rose up and did this because it was his responsibility to do it. It was his job to keep this area holy and clean. And this was his reason why he did it, because it was his office. And so he took a spear, perhaps from one of the guards there that were under him. Perhaps he carried a spear for this very purpose. It's very possible. And he went after the criminal who was violating this holy space by what he was doing. This is really what this story is about. And I think a lot of people don't point this out about Phineas, that this was his office to do this. But it helps us to understand the story better, I think, when we know that. So he followed this man and this woman, went after them in the pavilion, it says, in this tent, this public area. They're in this holy area. One blow through both of them. The Hebrew authorities are pretty agreed on what this means, the way this is written, that they were actually in the midst of an unrighteous act right there in that holy area, and that with one blow, he killed them both for their sin. You know, in the New Covenant scriptures, Messiah said, "Love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you." And here we have Phineas running a spear through his brother. A lot of people would think that's a contradiction. You know, it's apples and oranges, because really, when Yeshua says in the New Covenant scriptures to love your enemies, he's talking about your personal enemies that don't like you. He's not talking about you have the job, basically, like a police officer, to enforce the law, and a person is a criminal and commits a criminal act going into an unauthorized place. You know, today, if you go into certain unauthorized areas, they'll kill you. And there's a lot of places like that in the world. The military has places like that. Various religious organizations have places like that. There are some places it's off limits, and you know it's off limits, and you don't go there. So this is really nothing unusual. You know, countries all over the world have done this. There's nothing unusual about this, except for the fact, the part I think that's unusual, is that Phineas actually did his job. That part's kind of unusual, I think, because I think it's very hard to actually execute someone who is your own countryman, even if that's what's called for, according to the law, as it was here. I think it's still hard to do. But Phineas saw it as his duty, and he did it. And the fact that he rose up to do his duty proved that Israel as a whole was not responsible. And it proved that those who were in authority were enforcing Yahweh's covenant, and that Yahweh's order was being upheld. And so when all of that happened, it stayed the plague that had come on the sons of Israel. Yahweh saw the order that he put into place was working to bring this to an end. This is under control. Phineas was really the one that made that happen. There was a plague. So apparently the courts couldn't handle these cases fast enough. This was spreading so fast. And so Yahweh had to send out a plague against the evildoers. There were 24,000 that had involved themselves in this that were killed. Huge number. As a matter of fact, it says 24,000 here. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says that 23,000 fell. The 23,000 were the ones that actually fell from the plague. And then this 24,000 includes all the ones that fell from the plague as well as those that were executed. So there were 24,000 in all that were guilty parties that were sentenced and executed, rather directly by Yahweh or by the judges of the nation. Now, we realize this is a nation of several million people. So in terms of percentage, it's not a huge percent. It's not like 25% or something like that. It's a relatively small percent. But individual people, 23,000, yeah, that is really huge. 23,000 people that actually checked in their brain at the door and went after these women and got involved in this false worship. It's just mind-blowing. What I'd say to young men out there, and really I guess we're all capable of this is a weak area. Obviously, this is a weak area in people's lives. And Satan has often used this as a way of turning people away and drawing them into sin and sometimes a disaster that's so bad they never recover, like happened with these 24,000. That really can happen, and this is why we must all be vigilant. And really, we have to be helping one another in these matters. We're vulnerable in matters of the flesh. We all are. This is why this story, I think, is so vitally important to us today. And, part of this that comes across to me is that Israel was to be a set-apart nation because those around them didn't hold the same values they had. Yahweh gave them certain values that were embodied in the covenant. But the surrounding nations didn't have those values. And as soon as Israelites, these 23,000 or 24,000 of Israel, bought in to the more licentious sort of attitude of the people around them, they were toast. And this speaks a huge message to me in the time that we live in. Because really, the world around us is becoming more immoral, and there's a mindset developing in the world that condones all sorts of things that the scriptures don't condone, that make it all the more easy, I think, for believers just to be pulled off into immoral behavior. And I think this is going to be increasing a lot because the culture is changing. It's changed a lot in times past, but we are really on a roller coaster ride from this point in terms of the change of the culture. And we have to be aware of it. Yahweh's standards, Yahweh's covenant and his requirements haven't changed regardless of what the world does. We have to make up our mind and our heart about these situations before they even arise. And especially with the world changing the way it is, it's going to be throwing a lot of things at us that are going to be very difficult for people. And I believe we do need to be making decisions in advance of the problems. Verse 10 through 13.
Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned my wrath away from the sons of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I didn't consume the sons of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, Behold, I give him my covenant of peace. It shall be to him and to his seed after him the covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was jealous for his Elohim, and made atonement for the sons of Israel.
Here, Yahweh takes the initiative after this happens to speak to Moses. And he wants to talk to Moses about Phinehas. Yahweh says he's turned my wrath away from the sons of Israel. And the characteristic that Yahweh especially points out here is that Phinehas was jealous with Yahweh's jealousy. Yahweh saw that Phinehas expressed Yahweh's own jealousy. This is what we want. This is what we need from our leaders, from our spiritual leaders. We need spiritual leaders that will feel what Yahweh feels, and as a result of that, do what Yahweh does, instead of just doing what they want for themselves. And that's really what Phinehas did in his position. He was an official, he had a certain job, but he didn't just think, well, this is my job. He actually felt the same jealousy that Yahweh had. And then he acted on that, expressing Yahweh's actions, expressing Yahweh's wrath in the situation and his judgment, so that he brought an end to this plague. This is an amazing thing that Phinehas did, and that's exactly what leaders among God's nation need to do. It's a perfect pattern for us. We need to know Yahweh that well, that we feel what he is feeling so that we do what he would have us do, so that we truly can represent him in how we behave and how we act. An amazing thing. And Yahweh was just so impressed with that he said, I give a covenant of peace. He established a covenant of shalom with Phinehas. So Phinehas, and therefore his line, it says his seed after him, were given the covenant of an everlasting priesthood. It's not over. The overwhelming position among various Bible-believing groups about this would be that the Aaronic priesthood now is over. But according to this covenant, it's not over. It's everlasting. Now, this raises certain problems for people. This does not negate the priesthood of Yeshua Messiah, the Melchizedek priesthood. This in no way negates the sacrifice of Yeshua Messiah. Aside from those things, there's still a lot that the priests did that the nation really needs. What about, for instance, the Aaronic blessing? Whose responsibility was that? The priesthood. To bless the people. I would like to see some of the sons of Phinehas rise up and start blessing the people of Yahweh. That would be a pretty wonderful thing to have that happen. In the millennium, too, the millennium talks about the ministry of that priesthood. It's included in the prophecies regarding the millennium. So this is a covenant that Yahweh made with Phinehas and his seed after him. It's an everlasting covenant. It will continue in Yahweh's nation. It's not over. And this is because it says he was jealous for his Elohim and made atonement for the sons of Israel. I think that's huge. You know, I don't think Phinehas had any idea what was going to come to him because he did his job. This is pretty huge that Yahweh made this covenant with Phinehas. It's really something to think about. You know, when we do the righteous thing, when we choose to do what we should do, even when it's difficult and hard to do, Yahweh takes notice of that. He brings rewards to his people far beyond what we can imagine. This is what we see here, what happened with Phinehas in this covenant. Verse 14 and 15.
Now the name of the man of Israel that was slain, who was slain with the Midianite woman, was Zimri, the son of Salu, a commander of a father's house among the Simeonites. The name of the Midianite woman who was slain was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur. He was head of the people of a father's house in Midian.
We have this Israelite, and we find out he was not just a run-of-the-mill Israelite. There's a lesson there too, because many times, unfortunately, leaders can be overconfident, and because of that, they can end up falling into sin. Some of them can think like they're above it, you know. They're above punishment, above the consequences. Perhaps that's how he got so far into the holy precinct. Got past guards and things because they recognized him as a man of note, as one of the commanders. But did that stop Phinehas from doing his duty? No. And this is the truth about Yahweh's Torah, his laws, his commandments. They apply equally to everyone that is in the covenant. And in fact, those who have more responsibility are the ones that are held to the highest standard. This is Yahweh's way. So I think it helps us to kind of see this about this man, Zimri. It puts me in mind of what Paul said to the Ephesians as he was traveling back to Jerusalem. He told them that from among they themselves, now speaking to the elders among the people, that from among they themselves that the wolves would arise. That is exactly what has happened over and over again. Many times the leaders go bad, and then they end up leading the people into sin. And they are often targeted. And it's kind of a pattern that we see through time, just like Paul said it, just like we see it. And so this is why anyone that has it in their heart to be a leader of Yahweh's people, they have to realize that it's going to bring them into constant spiritual warfare all the time from every quarter, because they're a target that can really do a lot of damage if they can just be turned. So no one, no matter who they are, no matter what they know, what gifts they have, what office they hold, is above this happening to them. Nobody. This is why really we all need to be humble before God. We must be humble before Him, and we must always be open to His correction and looking for His correction in our life to save us from becoming overconfident and then stepping into something evil like Zimri did here. Well, then in verse 15, we have the Midianite woman that he was with, Cosbi. So basically what you've got here is a prince of Israel and a princess of Midian. So these people are among the nobles, or you might say the elite of these two nations. This even gets more interesting because when we get to Numbers 31, we find out that this Zur, who was her father, is listed as one of the kings of Midian. She is a real princess, the daughter of one of the kings of the nation of Midian. You know, perhaps he thought he had found quite a prize, someone worthy of a person of his position. He had found this princess for himself. But whatever the reason, it was a very bad idea. As a matter of fact, if we think this through a little more, we know that this was a plot. This whole event that happened, this was a plot. Balaam had laid this all out to the Midianites, and then they were following through with this. So what appears happened here is that this king of Midian actually employed his daughter in this plot. And the idea was that she was a leading person among the Midianites, and so she could enlist other Midianite women and Moabite women to be involved in this plot, while then she got this prince of Israel involved, then got him involved in the plot for him to stir up support, to involve Israelite men in this plot. Why would they go into the middle of the nation of Israel, into a public pavilion, and behave like this? Well, the purpose would be to draw away more of the people of Israel, because here's an influential Israelite that's doing this. So this would have to be part of this plot to draw these people away. And no doubt, they may have both been involved in starting this plot. I think from the standpoint of the average Israelite that got involved, they didn't know how this happened, right? They saw some good-looking woman looking their way, and they checked in their brain at the door, and pretty soon they're bowing down to the Baal of Peor, They've got no idea what's going on. But what really is going on is a conspiracy. Conspiracy theories, we hear about conspiracy theories all the time, and people always poo-poo conspiracy theories, and a lot of them are really pretty far out there and crazy. But the truth is, a lot of history has come about through conspiracies, and it's still that way. There's plotting going on all the time, and that's what happened here that caused this to happen. This was a plot, ultimately a plot of Satan, in order to bring harm and distress to Israel and to defame the name of Yahweh. And unfortunately, he had too much success in this case, because there were those who were willing to go along with the plot, who didn't even have the sense to know that this is what was really happening. But it is what was happening, and these ringleaders ended up getting what they deserved. Verse 16 through 18.
Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Harass the Midianites and strike them, for they harass you with their wiles, with which they have deceived you in the matter of Peor, and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of the commander of Midian, their sister, who was slain on the day of the plague in the matter of Peor.
It says, harass the Midianites and strike them, for they harassed you with their wiles. What does harass mean when he says harass them? It's war. When you conceive a plot to do evil to another nation, that's war, isn't it? And it says with their wiles, with their wiles. You know, a lot of us are pretty innocent, and it's a good thing. We're supposed to be innocent. But what we need to learn, and this story should help to teach us, is that a lot of people aren't innocent. And they can be very tricky. People that, you wouldn't suspect as being tricky. But they have their own idea of why they're doing things. And they mean to do you harm. And that's what wiles are about. It's a form of deception. To deceive a person into doing things that are going to harm themselves and others. They seem like your friends. They're acting like they're your friends. They're acting like they like you. But really what they're trying to do is destroy you. And that's what these young women were doing to these young men. They seemed appealing. They seemed attractive. These men were crazy about these women, literally. Crazy enough about them to actually abandon Yahweh and follow after the gods of these women. But were these women really doing what they were doing because they liked these men, or that they were looking out for the best interests of these men? Is that what they were doing? The same thing can happen to young women as well. Many, many times people do not present themselves with their real agenda. They are deceptive to get what they want, to get what they're after, and even if they're wanting to destroy somebody, to do that. This happens a lot, and a lot of times young people end up being deceived and end up being hurt. There were a lot of young men that died that day. They could not discern that they were being plotted against, and they fell right into the trap. It's just pathetic, it's just so sad. But it can easily happen to a person, and this is still true. In our world today, this sort of thing can happen a lot. Once the enemy has got you by the heart, you're pretty much sunk. So, you just really have to be aware and purpose in your heart as to who you're going to be and what you're going to do. I mean, that's just so important. Otherwise, unless you purpose to do it and you make the effort to keep yourself pure, to keep your life pure, to test everything, and to test everyone by the word. At some point along the line, the enemy can really do you harm. So you have to be vigilant. But Yahweh saw this, and he was going to inflict punishment on these Midianites because of what they did. The scriptures constantly promise us this. While we're told in the New Covenant scriptures not to retaliate against our enemies, the scriptures do tell us that Yahweh himself will retaliate against his enemies. And therefore, if people do this and they go about trying to set harm or try to do harm to the people of Yahweh, they have to realize that they will then have to deal with him. So while we ourselves, we won't retaliate to what they do, Yahweh is going to. And when he does, there will be a judgment for doing that evil to his people. Well, quite a story. It's stunning, especially right now, because we are at an amazing turning point in terms of the change in the culture. It's huge what has happened. a gigantic change in the culture, and yet Yahweh's covenant has not changed. He has not changed, his standards have not changed, but the environment in which we need to continue to be holy and separate, well, that environment has changed tremendously now. So I don't think these verses could be more timely than they are at this moment. James 1:12 through 15, and I'd encourage people perhaps to read that and meditate on it. It talks about temptation in those verses. It tells us not to think that we're tempted to evil by Elohim, because it says he doesn't tempt anybody. When we're tempted by our own desire. We're enticed by our desire. And you see, this is what the plot was. The plot of the enemy here was to entice these Israelites by their own lower nature, by their own desires. And then James says that that desire, when it conceives, bears sin. So, if we have a desire that's against Yahweh's laws, against his covenant, we need to rebuke that. We need to turn that away, and we need to make a definite decision. That's not where we're going. Because if we don't do that, then we just let that fester. It will bring us into the place of sin. And James says, when sin is full grown, it brings forth death. Sin isn't good. It doesn't bring forth good things. It brings forth very bad things. This is the process by which that happens, and the scriptures tell us about it, and we really can do something about it. Another passage of scripture in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, this is verse 5 through 13. In these verses, it talks about this very incident and some of the other incidents like it, where the people turned away from Yahweh, where they lusted after evil things and were drawn away. There, Paul says, neither let us commit sexual immorality as some of them committed, and in one day 23,000 fell. Neither let us test the Lord as some of them tested and perished by the serpents. Neither grumble as some of them grumbled and perished by the destroyer. And then he says this, now all these things happened to them by way of example, and they were written for our admonition, on whom the ends of the ages have come. Well, there was an end of an age in that time that Paul was living in, and that age came to an end at 70 CE. That was when the temple was destroyed and that whole Jewish system came to an end. But Paul mentions ends of ages. The other age that he has in mind is the age that we're in today. In fact, we live at the end of this age. These things were all written as examples to us so that we could benefit from these things that happened. These things are very relevant to us. There's lots of people in the world that would tell you this information isn't relevant anymore. But what the apostles say, it couldn't be more relevant. It's for us. Because Yahweh does not change. His righteousness doesn't change. His laws don't change. He hasn't changed his mind about any of this. And he's not going to change his mind. So even though the world has changed and continues to change, he doesn't change. And he's called us to be separate from the world, to live holy, sanctified lives. And I believe as we look at this story, we can see the dangers in not doing that, and we can see the blessings of faithfulness to him. Grow powerful in union with the Lord, in union with His mighty strength. Use all the armor and weaponry that God provides so that you will be able to stand against the deceptive tactics of the adversary. Moab's brother nation, Israel, was camped in the plains of Moab after defeating two of Moab's most powerful enemy nations. Fearing his nation would be next, and realizing he could not defeat Israel on the battlefield, Balak, the king of Moab, enlisted the soothsayer Balaam to curse Israel. 3 times Balaam tried, and 3 times Yahweh refused to curse it, even defended their righteousness. Balaam was really unable to curse them. Yahweh wouldn't let that happen. But now we see a different tact here. It mentions, though, Israel's location. It says that Israel was in Shittim. This is the last stop before finally they did go into Canaan. And the word Shittim, it's a certain kind of a tree. And today we call it the acacia tree. These grow all over Arabia. This word is actually shortened from a larger word that we find in Numbers 33:49 for this place called Abil Shittim, or meadow of the acacias. So apparently this was a place that was near the river. So acacia trees were growing there, and it was probably somewhat more pleasant than much of the desert that Israel had been through. So this is where Israel was at the time, and of course this is right actually in the border of Moab. Everything is looking so good right now. You know, they've just had these big victories and they're all just doing so well. And at the very time that they're feeling like that, for we are not struggling against human beings, but against the rulers, authorities, and cosmic powers governing this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. So take up every piece of war equipment God provides, so that when the evil day comes, you will be able to resist. And when the battle is won, you will still be standing. Therefore, stand. Israel, but blessed Israel instead. Balak and Balaam found that Yahweh will never curse Israel. That could have been the end of that story, but Hasatan still had his favorite trick in his arsenal. We learn of this in Bamidbar Numbers 25, the Peor affair. Here, in this warning example, since Yahweh would not curse Israel, Hasatan would enlist the aid of Israel to curse themselves. Here in Numbers chapter 25, really nothing could be more relevant. So we're going to get right into this now, verse 1 through 3.
Israel stayed in Shittim, and the people began to play the prostitute with the daughters of Moab, for they called the people to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate and bowed down to their gods. Israel joined himself to Baal Peor. Yahweh's anger burned against Israel.
It's so interesting. Yahweh had defended Israel before Moab, and